I've got in the studio with me here now former MP Michael Fabricant, former colleague of mine, to discuss this. I mean, this is very good news for reform, isn't it, this poll?
Of course it is, but I'll say what everybody says, which is it's only one poll. They always say that.
Well, all the recent polls have put
this
reform
month it's been bad news for the
25.
Conservative Party, that's for sure. And, of course, in a way, it's bad news for the right, I would argue, because it actually splits the vote by having two right-wing, if you can call the Conservative Party right-wing, maybe that's the problem, two right-wing parties, whereas Labour are alone on the left, apart from when you had the Gaza Party, as it were, you know, a few months ago.
Yes, and of course that doesn't affect every constituency, whereas we are seeing a reform vote share rise in every constituency. Of course, what people are now thinking is what happens at the next election. A lot of people are fed up with the Labour government, particularly people on the right who would call themselves Conservatives. But if it goes on as it is, with reform on 26, Conservative on 23, let's say, at the next election, Labour could still come through the middle.
Yeah, and that's really what happened this time, because it wasn't in 2024 people voting actively for the Labour Party. It was just simply to vote against the Conservatives. But in many areas, including yours, I suspect, and mine, reform took enough votes away from the Conservatives. And so I lost by a few hundred, you know, but that's democracy. But the interesting thing is, what do we do now? Now, I was involved in a WhatsApp discussion. Some people like to say spat. I wouldn't call it a spat at all. But anyway, a discussion on WhatsApp and saying we can't ignore reform. That's the Conservatives, can't ignore reform. And it's silly to bury your head in the sand. But to make any prediction about what happens in 4 years' time, I think is naive. Anything could happen. The Reform Party could implode, though I suspect that unlike previous incarnations when it was UKIP, when they imploded, I think they can now sense power and there'll be more self-discipline. So we have to decide, what do we do about it? Do we take action now? And I think that would be far too early. And indeed, both Nigel Farage and Kemi Badenoch have said, you know, we're not going to consider any coalition. But let's be honest, just between the two of us, you know, in 2009, if you'd said to the Conservatives, would you go into coalition with the Lib Dems? Both the Lib Dems and the Conservatives would have screamed, that's complete madness, it'll never happen. But of course it did happen, the famous Cameron-Nick Clegg coalition, if you can call it that.
But that was a post-election pact. And, of course, nobody could have predicted it. Nobody perhaps would have admitted to it in advance. But the difference this time is in order to get to the position where the Conservative Party and the Reform Party between them could form a government, there's going to have to be some sort of pre-election pact to stop this splitting of the vote. And the only mechanism I can see for that is for, let's say, Reform to choose 150 constituencies that they want to fight unopposed by the Conservatives, and the Conservatives to choose 150 constituencies that they want to fight unopposed by Reform. And that, of course, it couldn't happen now, but even if that does happen in 2 years' time, that'd be unbelievably contentious, wouldn't it?
It might be contentious, but a lot of people would say that's a business-like approach. And, you know, you've had enough experience of the House of Commons, and I have too, to know that the House of Commons and politics, sadly, is rarely business-like. So whether they come to that sort of agreement, I don't know. But if the right want to take... I hate saying the right, because it all sounds like when you talk about the far right, and this isn't far right, neither Reform nor the Conservatives.
It's where the centre was 20 years ago, Michael.
But if you want the right in and Labour out, I think, you know, if both parties are going strongish, one stronger than the other, who knows what it'll be in 2 or 3 years' time, there's got to be some pact or another.
Well, we're now joined in the studio by Christopher Hope, our political correspondent. Chris, what's your take on these latest discussions about a pact?
I think it's all everyone talks about away from the studio. It's great that at GB News we're trying to get out there into the open with a grandee like Michael Fabricant. I think it's certainly the question everyone's talking about is how will these two come together? Because your party and Farage's one agree on so many issues, don't they? I think what's happening here, though, is it's governing is hard. We're 8 months after your party lost 14 years in power. And the ideas we offered up, I think, by reform are just easy ones, you know, net zero on migration. Well, you know, how can you make that work if you've got a shortage in some parts of the economy and other parts? I think what the policy last week on delaying giving citizenship to those who came over in what's now been called the Boris wave under the Tory government is quite sensible. It shows the party is clearing up a mistake they made. It's a mistake being made clear by Kemi Badenoch. Delay giving those who arrived here until they're earning their way in this country. That makes sense. So there's a degree of logic to the Tory response so far. I think that, I'm just talking to a very senior shadow cabinet minister, the party has got a lot more active. Kemi Badenoch is doing a lot more things, probably around the 100 days past yesterday, but also aware that this polling here, looking at the reform on 26 points, Labour 25, Tories becalmed on 21, you know, at some point, will your colleagues start going, look, we agree with so many things, let's put ego to one side. The most important thing is getting Labour out of office.
Yeah, and isn't it also the case, though, that on the one hand, Kemi Badenoch, understandably, doesn't want to commit herself too early on in the electoral cycle. But on the other hand, if you create a vacuum where there's no policy, vacuums always get filled. And at the moment, it's being filled by reform.
And that policy on citizenship from Kemi Badenoch was the first unprompted policy. Until then, it's been in response to the Labour government. Finally, we have an idea of what she's doing. And it makes a degree of sense, I think. It's sorting out the problem that the Tory government
and that policy had been called for by a number of the Conservative-leaning think tanks for a number of weeks. It's interesting that was
and you, Miriam.
Indeed, yes, indeed, indeed. But I still think that there is of course, there are personality barriers to any kind of pact. Farage has probably had enough of doing a deal with the Conservatives after what happened in 2019. For obvious reasons, Kemi Badenoch does not want to commit to a party that wants to destroy hers. That's their stated aim. But actually, isn't the biggest barrier the voters? Because the politicians can sit there on high and say, well, you have that seat, you'll have this seat. But actually, doesn't that take away choice from voters in constituencies? And what happens if somebody who wants to vote reform arrives at the ballot box to realise that there's only a Conservative?
I think, but all main parties will stand candidates in every single seat.
But
they won't campaign hard whether they don't want to.
I think that will. I think that means the whole thing won't work. So, for example, in my seat, before the general election, the Reform candidate submitted his nomination with an hour to spare. No campaigning, no leaflets to speak of, 10,000 votes. Because people want to vote for Nigel Farage, and it doesn't matter whether they don't deliver a single leaflet, they will get the vote. So I think if they do a deal but still have Reform candidates stand, it will...
Have they told you they wouldn't campaign in your seat, and then they did?
I had no communication from Reform Party.
I wonder why they declared so late. I don't know why that is. I think...
Maybe you could ask.
It was disorganised. I mean, I know that Reform... And, you know, I have sympathy with them. It's a new party. They didn't have the structure. And so in quite a number of areas, it was a last-minute appointment. But there was no agreement, as far as I know. You need to get a Reform person in. But there was absolutely no agreement in any constituency not to put up a candidate. Of course, Gavin Williamson, my neighbour, played a blinder because he said he knew the candidate and he said, look, if you stand, you're not going to get elected. What you are going to do is get a Labour guy elected. Is that what you want? So the Reform guy, at the very last minute...
Pulled out.
And it was done at the very last minute. Otherwise, Reform would have appointed someone else to replace him.
But my point, though, is that it's all very well saying, oh, well, we just won't campaign. But I don't actually think leaflets and door-knocking make as much difference as people think. And people will vote for the party. If they want to vote for Nigel Farage, if they want to vote for Reform, they will, even if they've had a leaflet.
Well, no one takes advice from me. I've been around this game for 30 years. I know that Farage was really put out by 2019 when he stood down about 300 candidates to allow the Tories to win that big landslide 80-seat majority under Johnson to deliver Brexit, and so it goes on. But he's really hurt. But no one said thank you. He got no help.
I said to Boris Johnson, I can tell you,
it's simply a respect issue.
Boris Johnson, you're just lining up trouble. If A, you don't acknowledge the huge role that Nigel Farage played in getting us Brexit, and not giving him a knighthood or even a peerage. And you know what? If you'd given him a peerage, unless he decided to do a Tony Benn and stand down, he wouldn't have been able to be an MP.
But can I say, Chris, finally, the reason why that matters is you want to do a deal, you do it now. You don't allow Reform to appoint people to the seats, because he won't stand them down. So the time to do it in a cycle is now, not in 2 years' time. By then he's selected his best seats, he won't want to stand them down.
Indeed.
The clock is ticking for Kevin Badenoch and Nigel Farage.
Is there a case for proportional representation?
No way. You know, people criticise Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his government. Now, Israel is a complete Western democracy, but they have proportional representation. And just like in Germany, which also has slightly less proportional representation than Israel, you've got to get into bed with some pretty unsavoury characters. I mean, we had to get into bed with the Lib Dems. That was bad enough. But this is
well-known extremists.
We don't want to get extremists getting elected and then in government.
If I can, I've got to bring you news from lobby. I've been in a lobby meeting with the PM's deputy official spokesman. All quite quiet, but the Labour MPs have tabled an amendment calling for a 4-day working week. The government's confirmed this is not government policy to support a 4-day working week. Is that a relief for you, Michael Fabricant?
Well, speaking about government policy, of course, we've had a new health minister appointed after the sacking of Andrew Gwynn, and she had some interesting views. I think she doesn't like single-sex toilets, and she thinks people can identify as llamas. Here's what Lee Anderson, the Reform MP, had to say.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, the new health minister has stated that it's OK for a human being to present as a llama. So what I want to know is if I have a family member who presents as a llama, suddenly becomes ill in the middle of the night, do they send for a doctor, a vet, or a straitjacket?
Mr. Speaker, I can just say to the honourable member that my honourable friend, the Minister for Public Health, believes in treating every human being with the dignity and respect they deserve, even the honourable gentleman.
Michael, I mean, this health minister, surely she's retracted her views on llamas.
She hasn't. No, she's sticking with it. I mean, I've got a soft spot for llamas. I've got to reveal this in GB News. A friend of mine, a broadcaster and ex-member of Parliament, actually, Matthew Parris.
Oh, yes.
Famously, because he wrote it up in the Times because he was very annoyed with me, I was going to buy one of his llamas because I share a property with a well-known friend of mine in Wales, and we wanted a couple of llamas there, and we didn't get them in the end for complicated reasons, but I'll have nothing said against llamas. I'm very fond of them. In fact, I got told off many years ago when I was saying that I love llamas. And someone
Indeed,
said, no,
Michael,
this sounds like bestiality, Michael.
Can I just go back to what she
You
said?
surely don't identify as one.
She made these comments on Twitter before she was an MP in her defence. OK, and she did say, she was asked, you know, should people be taken seriously if they want to be a llama? She replied, yes, and treat you with dignity and respect. So before she's an MP, you all had lives before your MPs. She said things being judged by them. But on WhatsApp groups, Michael, I was going to ask you, what's the worst thing you've ever seen on a WhatsApp group? You must have seen some quite
I've seen some horrendous things on WhatsApp group, but I was just thinking the sort of thing that she was saying before she was an MP, I've been saying, as you well know, because you follow me on Twitter when I was an MP.